Uh, the presentation itself should take about 30 to 40 minutes, so I would like to keep that 30-40 minutes for the presentation. And then once we're done with the presentation, then I would like to take up the questions that you might have. Now at this point of time, as you all might be aware, that the PCI DSS standard version 3.0 is official. And there are still a lot of questions that are being shared, a lot of doubts that people have. So I would try and do my best to answer your questions. If in case I'm not able to answer, then I would like to take down the question, and then we would get back to you through mails for these questions as such. Alright, so just to set the tone and the intent of this particular presentation, what we plan to share today is to basically share the highlights from the changes that we see in the version PCI DSS version 3 and 3.0. There are quite some changes. I probably wouldn't call them as a major change. It is an improvement in a lot of ways from the version 2.0. So this particular presentation would start with looking at some of the reasons as to why the changes have come into place. Some of the reasons as have been shared by the PCI Council. And the intent of the changes, and then we'll try and look at some of the changes as such. I might not be able to touch upon all the changes because there are quite some of them, but I would like to try and pick up the most obvious changes that we see as of now. And I'm sure that as the talking circles and the implementation structures move on this year, we might probably be looking at more and more, detailing coming out for the newer changes or the controls as such. All right. So to start, first of all, like I have shared, the intention is to try and highlight the changes that we see in the PCI DSS version 3 and 3.0. Basic understanding is that the audience who have logged into this particular session are probably aware of what PCI DSS 2.0 already has. I've tried to structure my presentation such that I can try answer it in both versions. Now, we all are aware of the change in the standard, the version of the standard as such. That is, we knew that version 2.0 is what currently is the PCI DSS version, and the new version is 3.0. Now, something that most of us are aware, but I would just like to share this point. The PCI Council itself has got a life cycle that they maintain for the standards. So each standard, each version would have a 36 months life cycle. Now, during this 36 months of life cycle, the council basically gets a lot of feedback from the market, looks at what are the new trends, and then starts working on the upgrade of the versions. So these are the major version change as such. So what we have seen, the PCI DSS version 1.2 changed to 2.0, and then now we are talking about the version 3 and 3.0. Just before I proceed, I would just like to quickly check, is my voice clear? If or would you, should I be a little more loud? Okay. All right. So apart from the fact that the major changes in the standard version itself, which follows a 36-month life cycle, there are some of the changes in terms of fine-tuning the major release as such. For instance, Now that the version 3.0 is official, in the due course of time, the council keeps checking how exactly is this version of the standard being implemented or accepted, and if there are any sudden or if there are any minor changes that have to be done, those would be released in terms of the errata changes. Now, so trying to look at what are the drivers for this particular change, or what are the for the version PCI DSS version 3.0 to have the enhancements or the changes from the version 2.0. What have been the major drivers? Now, these drivers, what I have tried to list down here, is based on the interactions that we have had with the council, is also based on our experience as a QSA that we see in the market, and the same feedback has been shared with the council as part of the community meetings. So during the community meetings of the PCI standard to share their views. Now, some of the reasons for the changes are the evolving technologies as such. Threats that we get to see now, based on the different breaches that are taking place. A constant need of clarifying what is the intent of the requirement. What is the reason for a certain requirement that is being pushed as part of the PCI DSS standard? Feedback from the market, that is what I have shared. The lack of, these are the common aspects that we as a QSA, plus the feedback that we do receive, or the responses that we did receive from the PCI Council. In fact, this is as latest as the Asia Pac community meeting which took place in the month of November last year. This, the version 3.0 was a major point of discussion during that particular session too. Some of the challenges that we personally as a QSA have seen, which we strongly believe is one of the, is also the driver for these changes. One that I would like to specify is the management process of the organizations to maintain the compliance to PCI DSS. What we have observed, or what we see, is that the first cycle of the implementation, the organizations are usually completely involved in the implementation, and they all the effort in terms of implementing the requirements is seen, the best of the efforts. But the following year, the requirements of the standard are such that it could be spread across that, there are activities to be done on a daily basis, weekly basis, monthly basis, quarterly basis. This is where organizations usually don't follow the requirements. And this is what has typically been the reason for the break in terms of the PCI DSS framework that is implemented. Some of the reasons being, organizations look at PCI DSS as a one-time activity and not as a continuous activity. The level of awareness about the standard and what needs to be followed is something that is not on the higher side. And these are the aspects that are also captured or also shared as a feedback with the PCI Council, which is one of the reasons why you find some of the changes in the version 3.0 now. Now, when we talk about 3.0, what can I say in terms of an overall change? The overall change, I would definitely say that it's definitely an improvement when we try and look at the version 2.0. There's a lot more clarity that is brought into the standard in terms of what is the intent of the requirements. There's a lot more clarity that has been brought in with regard to how is it that these requirements have to be implemented and continued with that particular implementation framework. In terms of the assessment part, there is not any change that you would find as in a QSA doing the assessments. The overall core structure of the PCI DSS 2.0, that is the core 12 requirements of the standard, is still maintained in the same way in the version 3.0 also. Now, in terms of the visual look and feel, that is when you pick up the PCI DSS requirements version 2.0, and if you pick up the PCI DSS requirements 3.0, the visible changes that you can see is the 2.0 had the columns of the PCI DSS requirement, the testing procedure, in place, not in place, target date, and comments. Now the 3.0 has been changed, and just to also mention with regard to Loop 2.0, the Council had also released a navigation document, a document that basically explained the intent of each of the requirements. In the version 3.0, the Council has included the navigation document as a part of the this particular requirements document itself. So you have the PCI DSS requirements now, the testing procedures, and the third column is the intent of each of the requirements. And definitely I would say if you try to compare 2.0 and 3.0, the clarity that the Council has tried to bring in with regard to a lot of controls that were probably not that very clear. In the version 3.0 now, the clarity has been definitely shared as a part of the standard. All right, so like I had shared before, again just trying to look at the reasons for these changes, probably just trying to put them under these heading that you see here, lack of awareness, education. One of the aspects that the Council has been trying to push across is with regard to the awareness levels of be it the merchants or the service providers. This has been one of the aspects that also could probably lead to the extent of saying that, you know, the reason for a security breach is because an organization service provider is not really aware as to what is to be followed as part of the standard, or you know, what is it that what are the best practices to follow with regard to the usage of the card data. Probably one of the points that I would like to show present or discuss over here is the acceptance of PCI DSS as such is only looked at as a compliance requirement, which is what exactly the standard wants to change. The Council would want to change with with the version 3.0. It's not only a compliance requirement. It is probably the best practices that you can think of when dealing with the card data. Point number two, the testing mechanisms. The process of doing it could be the vulnerability assessments, the penetration testing, the internal scans, external scans, or the whole process of the segmentation by itself. There have been instances where clients have implemented segmentation, but there is no proper check that is done, test that is done on these segments that have been created, which sort of led to breaches that the organization was not really aware of. Another major aspect, like I have shared a little while back, the whole point of considering PCI DSS as a one-time activity. That is, there's a gap in terms of who would be the owner to ensure the continued compliance of the standard. These have been some of the major reasons that have probably brought in the changes that we get to see in the version 3.0 now. Alright, so what is it that the version 3.0 would like to emphasize upon? To consider the standard as a best practice in terms of the information security setup that you need to have when you're involved in using the card data. or when you're involved in either processing, storing, or transmitting the card data. Consider PCI DSS as a methodology that you would follow. It has to become a business as usual activity. It is not a one-time activity. It is not something that you have to prepare yourself before the audit is done, because that would definitely not work in line with you being compliant to the standard. All right. Now just trying to get to the changes in the version 3.0 as such. If you look at the changes in the PCI DSS version 3.0, the changes are classified into clarifications, additional guidance, evolving requirements. Clarifications is basically explaining the intent of the requirement a little more. And in this particular PCI DSS version 3.0, the Council has defined or given more clarifications for some of the controls that were probably not that very clear. During my presentation today, I would probably not stress more upon the clarification, because the intent has been the same from the version 2.0 to the version 3.0. Probably where I would try to spend a little more time would be in terms of the evolving requirements, as these are the new requirements which have come into the PCI DSS version 3.0. Okay. Now trying to look at the summary of the changes. Now I'm specifically talking about the clarifications, like what I had shown in my previous slide, and the table that you see on the left side basically just gives the number of changes or the additional clarifications that have been given in each of the requirements. For your reference, on the right side, I have also listed down what are the requirements. So you basically get to see that requirement 1, which basically talks about install and maintain a firewall configuration. There are 6 additional clarifications that the Council has brought into in the PCI DSS version 3.0. Similarly, you have the requirement 2, 3, 4, 5, and the clarifications have been provided for each of these sections. I would, okay, this was in terms of the clarifications. In terms of the evolving requirements, if you look at the slide that I have up here now, there are about 20 evolving requirements that the PCI DSS version 3.0 has brought into place. Again, I have listed the new evolving requirements as per the core 12 requirements of the standard. So requirement 1 has 2 new requirements which has come into place. Similarly, requirement 2 has 1. I would try, and in the course of my presentation today, I have actually tried to concentrate more on these evolving requirements that it would help the group that has joined this particular presentation to basically understand what are the changes, what does it mean that you would have to do when you have to move from version 2.0 to version 3.0. In terms of the additional guidance, we have 11.2 that has been, so basically the in terms of the clarifying the requirement, in terms of additional guidance that is required, there is this one 3.0. All right. Some highlights that the PCI DSS 3.0 assessment procedure itself has clearly talks or states. In terms of the initial few pages of the procedure, the version 2, 2.0 and the version now, that is the 3.0 version, have got some distinct changes, and the Council has tried to bring in more clarity with regard to some of the aspects. Like if you look at the first point, the version 3.0 now clearly states sensitive authentication data must not be stored after authorization, even if PAN is not being stored in the setup. There was some amount of discussions that we as a QSA have also had with a lot of clients that we have, is how would you consider sensitive authentication data as a part of the card data when I don't have the PAN number being stored. So this is a clarity that the Council has now brought in the version 3.0, where they clearly state that irrespective of the fact that an organization stores the PAN numbers or not, sensitive authentication data itself cannot be stored neither in an encrypted form. Post authorization, the SAT data cannot be stored. The version 3.0 has also explained about the relationship between PCI DSS and PA DSS a little more. Probably what I would like to share for this particular point is from our experience. Again, the notion that many organizations have that if they procure a PA DSS certified application and install it in their setup, then they would automatically comply to the requirement of PCI DSS. This, to an extent, is not really true. Reason being, all the PA DSS certified applications, they come with a guideline that in terms of how these applications have to be installed, how these applications have to be configured. If the organization does not follow that guideline that has been shared with the PA DSS certified application, then you are not in compliance to PCI DSS. It's only when you implement the application in line with the guidelines that you can be rest assured that the application would comply to all the requirements of PCI DSS. So some amount of clarity that the PCI DSS version 3.0 has brought in with regard to the explaining this aspect also. All right, and the rest is what we would be basically seeing as we move on with this particular presentation. I would be basically sharing the minor changes, but visibly what you can see in the version 3.0 is there are a lot of change in terms of the wording that the standard that the Council has used. For example, 2.0 talks about implementing FIM, File Integrity Monitoring. Now, in the version 3.0, they have actually changed this to use terms like a mechanism to identify changes to the critical files. Instead of referring to it as FIM, as a requirement of FIM, they have changed it to a wording which says that a mechanism. All right. Now starting with the clarifications as such, and I'm looking at requirement 1, 2, 3. I have just picked few of the points. This is definitely not the entire list of the clarifications as such. If you look at the requirement 1.1x, the PCI DSS version 3.0 clearly segregates the documentation requirement and the implementation requirement. So one change is common to most of the requirements of the standard in 3.0. The Council has visibly segregated the documentation related checks and the implementation related requirements. And just to jump some of the slides a little, because this point is probably a little more relevant to the discussion that we are having here. The requirement 12, which concentrates more in terms of the policies and procedures as per the version 2.0. In the newer version 3.0, the requirement 12 in terms of the policies and procedures has been spread across all the 12 requirements of the standard. Essentially, trying to bring in the importance of policies, procedures for each of the requirements, and that there's no slippage in terms of ensuring that the framework itself, the PCI DSS framework itself in an organization becomes a little more stronger. Then looking at the requirement 1.1.6, previously in the version 2.0, this was 1.1.5. There is more clarification that is brought into the new version in terms of listing down the examples of insecure services, the protocols, ports. Then the requirement 1.5, which was not present in the 2.0, it is more a documentation related requirement, and that it clearly mandates that these set of policies and procedures should exist in an organization, and that is being very specific to the requirement 1 that talks about the firewall aspects. Some of the highlights from the requirement 2 clarify that the requirement for changing vendor default password applies to all default passwords, including system, application, security software, terminals. So the clarity that they have brought in terms of wording the intent of the requirement in version 3.0 for this particular requirement is a little more detailed now. Similarly, when we look at the requirement 3.5.2, okay, just to share in my presentation, wherever I have mentioned in bracket previous 1.1.5 or previous 3.5.2, this refers to the PCI DSS version 2.0. What I have stated as the requirement is as per the version 3.0. Okay. Now, the version 2.0 did talk or did have clarity in terms of how the key management process should work. What has been done in the version 3.0 now, there's a lot more detailing that has been brought in terms of clarifying the intent of how the split key has to be used, or the dual control of the keys if there is a manual encryption keys which are being used. Such kind of clarity is what you find in the version 3.0. Moving on to the next slide, looking at the requirements for 4.1, the explanation in terms of what are all the examples of open public networks. This is a snapshot from the PCI DSS 3.0. So if you look at it, the block which you see on the left side is version 2.0. The one that you see on the right is the version 3.0. So now the examples that they have mentioned, so they are so the standard is making it a little more clear in terms of what does it mean when they use the term open or public network. Basically listing down the examples as the internet, the wireless technologies, GSM, CDMA, GPRS, satellite connections. So some of the enhancements that the council has brought into this particular this particular version. Then going back to requirement 5, a common misconception or a common understanding that many organizations have is that the requirement 5 basically talks about Windows systems, and this has been a debate in a lot of circles. Many QSAs basically go with the fact saying that okay, Windows are the most vulnerable system, so we are looking at antivirus only for Windows systems, which is not the right thing. The intent of this particular requirement from 2.0 itself was never to limit it to only Windows systems. Version 3.0 brings in more clarity in explaining the exact intent of the requirement 5, which basically says commonly affected platforms. Windows definitely is a commonly affected platforms, but that doesn't mean the rest of the platforms are not. As the threat landscape changes, as the risks keep increasing or changing, today we are seeing the rest of the platforms also being impacted because of malware or viruses. So requirement 5 now, as part of 3.0, has brought in more clarity and mandates the organizations to constantly check for each of the platforms that they have, and to see if there are any such instances. So if yes, I mean, if there is an instance that is found that there are malwares or there are different types of viruses, then the organization would definitely have to look at implementing the antivirus for those platforms too. Moving on to the next slide, requirements 6.1, which previously was 6.2. So there is some reordering and restructuring in terms of the requirement numbers that you get to see in the new version, which is again keeping in mind that there are certain new controls which have been brought into place. A lot more explanation that has been given. The requirements have been split into multiple sets to basically differentiate between the documentation and the implementation part. So there are there are certain switching in terms of the requirement numbers, and specifically with regard to the requirement 6.1 and 2. The understanding was that the requirement 6.2, as per the version 2 and 2.0, logically is the first stage when you talk about any change management process. So that logical switch is what they have brought by renumbering the requirement, the previous requirement 6.2 to 6.1 now. Okay. Now looking at the requirement 8, there's some generic changes that has been brought into place. There are changes that actually give a little more flexibility to organizations in terms of the implementation part. For instance, if I look at okay, that would be actually coming as a part of the evolving changes, so I would take that point a little later in the following slides. But for now, when we talk about the clarifications, there is a little more clarity that the new version has brought with regard to, let's take the example of the requirement 8.3, which clarifies that two-factor authentication applies to users, admin, and all third-party, including vendors, who access even for a support maintenance kind of a work. So any external access to the card data environment, two-factor authentication would apply. So the intent has been the same as part of version, the previous version and this version. It is just the detailing that has changed in the new version now. Requirement 9.2 clarifies the intent of the requirement to identify, distinguish, and grant access to on-site personal visitors, and the batches are just one option. So if you look at the previous version, it looked like that the batches were the only way in which this particular requirement could be met. 3.0 is now looking at all the possible controls that an organization can have that can suffice this particular need. So it says that batches is just one of the options. So if there is another existing process that you have that essentially mitigates the risk coming out of this particular requirement, that can be considered as a control or as a mechanism to mitigate the risk from this particular check. Requirement 10.1 clarifies that audit trails should be implemented to link access to system components to each individual user rather than just establishing a process. Some wrong conception or wrong understanding of the requirement 10.1 due to the wording that was present in the version 2.0 is what they have clarified now in the version 3.0. Requirement 11.2.1 clarifies that quarterly internal vulnerability scans include rescans as needed until all high vulnerabilities as identified by PCI requirement 6.1 are resolved and must be performed by qualified personnel. Essentially, the intent has been the same. Even the previous version did talk about the rescans. The new version now re-emphasizes the whole point and says that the rescans are a must to basically until the high findings have been closed and the scans show that these vulnerabilities no longer exist. So that rescan approach or aspect is what is being re-emphasized as a part of the new version now. And the next point is what I had shared a little while back. So the previous requirement 12.1.1 and 12.2, which was essentially looking at the information, the policy, the information security policy, or the policies and procedures that an organization needs to have in place. This is now split into each of the requirement of the standard. So you find policies and procedures being checked or being referred to in the requirement 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 till the requirement 11 as part of the version 3.0. Intent of this particular change is to ensure that the PCI DSS framework that an organization has in place is not only restricted to just one section of the standard, so the importance of it is missed out, but to basically ensure that the policy procedure related checks are in place for each of the requirements as you start from the first requirement of the standard till you move till the last. So the intention is to try and ensure that the framework itself becomes much more stronger. It is quite, it's clearly articulated that the importance of the policies and procedures is very high to ensure that framework doesn't break, and it does, and that an organization does sustain that framework as a part of as a part of the business as usual processes that they have in place. All right. So the previous slides was in terms of the clarity and that the standard has brought into place with regard to giving more details or explaining the intent of the standard more. From here, I'm looking at the evolving requirements as such. So these are the new requirements of the PCI DSS 3.0. Some of them have been, again, the intent was present in the older version, but it was not clearly defined as to what has to be the checking process or what has to be the plan, do, checked, act cycle for these particular controls. So that has been clearly defined as a part of the new version now. So if I look at the requirement 1, there is requirement 1.1.2 and 1.1.3. Previously 1.1.2, the network diagrams must include an added new requirement as 1.1.3 for a current diagram that shows card data flows. I have brought in another column, and, if you see, if you look at this particular table to the right side, that is the change impact. This is where I would like to discuss what does it mean. What does this new requirement as such mean for an organization? Now, as part of the PCI DSS work that we have also done for a lot of clients, we see that there is a network diagram that is maintained by all the organizations. There is a subset of that overall network diagram that basically just highlights the systems, the network components that are part of the PCI DSS scope. Now version 3.0 is clearly mandating that creation of card data flows. That is, all these systems, network devices, wherever the card data traverses, that flow also has to be documented, captured by the organizations. Then looking at the change in the new requirement in the requirement 2 of the standard, that is 2.4, that mandates new requirement to maintain an inventory of system components in scope for PCI DSS to support development of configuration standards. Now the version 2.0 did talk about maintaining configuration standards. It spoke about maintaining a cardholder matrix or an inventory of all the systems that are there in the PCI DSS scope. 3.0 basically is linking these both and stating that as part of your inventory, you have to maintain an inventory of all the systems, network devices, all the assets that fall in the scope of PCI DSS that can be clubbed under people and the process and the technology part. The inventory of the same has to be maintained, and using that as the basis, the organization has to maintain the configuration standards for all the different platforms that they have. Then there are no new requirements or additions in the requirement 3 and 4 of the standard as such, apart from the clarifications that they have brought, which we have discussed in the slides before. Coming down to the requirement 5, this is what I had also shared before. Requirement 5.1.2, requirement to evaluate evolving malware threats for any system not considered to be commonly affected by malicious software. The term commonly affected systems was something that was interpreted in different ways by be it by a QSA or be it by an organization that is trying to implement PCI DSS. 3.0, the new standard, brings in more clarity and states or makes it very clear the intent of 5.1.2 is not only the so-called commonly affected systems, which used to be considered as the Windows systems, but for an organization to also be aware that there are other platforms that could have a malware or any kind of a malicious software. So if you look at the next slide 2, that is the requirement 5.3, this is also linked to the previous 5.1.2. That is, this requirement to ensure that antivirus solutions are actively running. Formerly this was 5.2 and cannot be disabled or altered by users unless specifically authorized. So they have brought in additional level of control when we talk about the antivirus, and if there is a need for the antivirus to be temporarily disabled or altered for any certain changes. Now that sort of a change as part of the new requirement now has to follow the change process, has to go through a change process where basically it clearly states what is the intent, why is it, and it has to be a time-based change. It cannot be a permanent change. Now looking at the requirements 6 and 8 of the standard. Requirement 6, there's a new requirement that is 6.5.10. This is for coding practices to protect against broken authentication and session management. We are aware as part of 2.0, the standard does give a list of all the possible threats that can come into picture when you talk about any application that is being developed. So the 2.0 spoke about SQL injection, spoke about different types. Now, as part of the evolving changes, as part of the newer threats that are coming into place, 3.0 basically talks about broken authentication and session management. Post 1st of July 2015, till then, these two aspects as such, it's good to have a check related to these two aspects. But post 1st of July, this becomes a mandatory requirement as such. So the testing procedures itself on the coding aspects should cover these two points shared. Then if you look at the requirement 8, specifically talking about 8.2.3, the term, the previous version, that is 2.0, talks about passwords, and the option of the passphrases was never actually documented or seen as a part of the previous version. That is a change that the new version has now brought into picture. So combine minimum password complexity and strength requirements into single requirement and increase flexibility for alternatives that meet equivalent complexity and strength. Certain challenges that even we have seen in the organizations is when there are certain passwords that cannot be changed due to the technical challenge. That is, the system itself does not allow for these passwords to be changed. So now the version 3.0 is actually looking at alternate ways in which you can still ensure that the risk is mitigated, but there could be other ways in which the same could be achieved. So that flexibility is what this particular new version has brought into place now. Then looking at 8.5.1, requirement for service providers with remote access to customer premises to use unique or authentication credentials. Again, the factor of the service provider. So another major aspect that version 3.0 is trying to bring into place is the third-party related checks and balances. This is what they have, the council has also shared as one of the reasons for the breaches that have taken place in the recent past. That is, organizations not really being aware as to what are the requirements that a service provider would have to comply to. Are they in compliance to these particular requirements or not? Or if they access their setup, then what is the mechanism that is to be used? So such controls to ensure that such kind of risks are mitigated is what you get to see now in this new version. I'm just trying to keep a track of the time also. I think I'm running a little low on time. So moving on to the next. Right, 9.3, probably another area that has brought in quite some considerable amount of change. Nothing of this was present in the version 2.0. 9.3 and 9.9. 9.3 specifically talks about the the physical access for the members to the so-called sensitive areas. On-site personnel, any person, it could be the staff member, it could be a third party. That control mechanism has to be in place. Now, how could this impact as such? Based on the setup that are there, this might also get into a stage where organizations may have to look at actually creating newer physical segmentations. That is, it could be like an enclosed space that is for the teams that are considered as, or for the areas that are considered as for those particular regions itself. And then if you look at 9.9, 9.9 basically is a new requirement which talks about the point of sale terminals. So to protect the devices that capture, so wherever there's a physical swipe, essentially the point of sale devices, for any sort of checks to be done to ensure any sort of tampering or any sort of changes that might be physically done on the devices. So this is a new requirement that has been brought in. Now, what could this lead to? This could eventually lead to a lot of training and awareness that would have to be brought in to the merchants where the point of sale devices are being used, because they would have to get into a process of doing a physical check. It could be as simple as, is there any additional wire that is connected to the POS device? Is there any additional device that is getting connected to the POS device? Something that was not there before. Some such kind of changes. Changes in terms of, does it look like the POS machine itself has been opened, or, there's some sort of a tampering evidence which is seen. So these are the kind of checks that would have to be brought in, which means that there would be considerable amount of effort going into training the members as to how these checks are to be done. Then requirement 10, essentially 10.2 to 2.5, enhanced requirement to include changes to identification and authentication mechanism, including creation of new accounts, elevation of privileges. So we are all aware as to all the logging requirements that has been that is present as part of 2.0 also. The newer version clearly states the intent and goes up to the extent of saying that any changes in terms of even creating a new account, changing the level of the privileges also has to be captured as a part of the logs. What could this translate into? This could probably translate into a higher level of logging itself to be enabled on the devices. Similarly, when we look at 10.2 to 2.6, enhanced requirement to include stopping or pausing of the audit logs. So the new version now clearly states that anytime the audit logs is stopped from being captured or is re-initiated, these details also have to be captured as a part of the logs as to basically keep a track of who and what have and why that particular change. Then looking at the requirement 11, enhanced requirement to include an inventory of authorized wireless access point and a business justification to support scanning for unauthorized wireless devices, and added new requirement 11.1.2 to align with an already existing testing procedure. That is, clubbing the incident management procedures to any incidents of any unauthorized wireless access points which are seen. The overall intent, to meet this particular intent, I don't foresee any major changes apart from the already existing inventory of all the systems that are in scope of PCI DSS. That inventory should clearly also list down all the wireless access points which the organization owns. So that is the authorized wireless access point. So in the event there is any unauthorized access point that is discovered, so the control mechanism to check is to basically validate is this particular access point a part of the authorized inventory list or not. So that is the change that you see as a part of the 11.1. 11.3, requirement to implement a methodology for penetration testing. This again becomes effective from 1st of July 2015. Probably another way as to how I would share the intent of this. There have been instances that we have seen that clients have said, I'm doing a penetration test, and that penetration test essentially meant bringing in an external laptop, trying to connect it to any of the network ports in the setup and run scan tools. Now, with the basic security aspects, that is, an external laptop cannot connect to an internal setup. All the scans which were run using these tools showed a clean scan. That is, no penetration was possible. That mechanism as to what is the kind of penetration test that has to be carried out was not clearly evident as part of the old version. 3.0 now clearly states it's not the same, but to use NIST SP 800-115 or any methodology that is equivalent or meets that same intent of what a penetration test has to be. Then 11.3.4 specifically states this again. This is one of the presentations which was done by the PCI Council that I had also attended. The example that they shared is many organizations have started bringing in segmentations to basically reduce the scope of PCI DSS, the scope of PCI DSS, which is a very good thing. So essentially, organizations do understand that segmenting the setup can create a smaller scope for PCI DSS. However, these segments itself were not being tested as to is the segmentation being done properly. The kind of rules that have been defined to create this particular segment, are these rules strong enough or not? Would they give rise to any sort of a breach? So, and there have been practical instances where they have been breaches despite the segmentation being done, and that is because of the kind of improper segmentation which was done. So essentially 11.3.4 is a new requirement that they clearly state that if there is a segmentation that is done as a part of the PCI DSS scope, then the penetration test should clearly demonstrate that the segments that have been created is at par with all the security practices. The rules that have been defined does not allow any unauthorized access or a breach. So these segments as such, the configuration of the segmentation has to be covered as a part of the penetration test. 11.5.1, let me just try to be a little more faster. Requirement to implement a process to respond to any alerts generated by the change detection mechanism. Previously, the term which was being used was, the standard would say any alerts being raised from IPS or IDS. Now they have changed the verbiage and they basically say change detection mechanism. So linking of the incident response or an alert mechanism and a process to respond to the alerts. I don't see any significant change as such required for these points that we have shared. In terms of an organization moving from PCI DSS version 2.0 to 3. Let's look at the last two points too. 12.8.5, requirement to maintain information about which PCI DSS requirements are managed by each service provider and which are managed by the entity. So, as I shared before, the Council is trying to bring in more clarity that an organization needs to maintain with regard to the kind of agreement that an organization has with its service provider. If an organization has a service provider that is involved in some way with the card data, then the kind of the service providers should, I mean, by default should actually sign off in terms of managing the security of the card data of the organization. And when I use the word sign off, what I mean is in terms of a contractual agreement, which is what we see in 12.9, a requirement for service providers to provide written agreements, acknowledgements to their customers as specified at the requirement 12.8. So essentially, post 1st of July, these agreements are something that have to be in place. So it's more of a mandate that the parent organization should have an agreement with the third parties, with the service providers, especially where there is card data involved. All right. So those were the new requirements as such, in enhancements or the newer changes that you get to see with regard to the version 3.0. Now, what does it mean in terms of the timelines? The version 3.0 was officially released in November last year. As of 1st of Jan this year, the version is 3.0 is effective. Organizations that are compliant to PCI DSS 2.0 have to get certified to version 3 by 2015. So, as also shared by the council, it doesn't mean if currently you are compliant to 2.0, then there's nothing that basically stops you to move into version 3.0 in this current year also. It's in fact, it would be a good thing, and the council also encourages the organization to move into 3.0 in this particular current year too. Way forward, what we see, what would it take for an organization that is already certified to 2.0 to move to 3.0? We have seen the highlights of the changes that we have discussed in the slides before. There would be some amount of assessment that an organization would have to take up to essentially understand where do they stand as against the new version. Now, this can be something that can be done internally, provided the internal resource is is aware of what are the changes and what does the version 2.0 state or what is the version 3.0 state. But the way forward would be to essentially conduct a gap assessment to identify are there any gaps. The way we if you're in compliance to aspects that would have to be considered to essentially get to that to the compliance levels of 3.0. And if it is for an organization that has not yet implemented any of the versions, the best way forward would be to start implementing with the 3.0 version itself, and not to get not to start with 2.0 now and then try and move into the to the upgraded version. Right, so that essentially brings me to the end of the presentation, and as I had stated before, my intention was to basically share the changes, what is to be expected as part of the new PCI DSS version 3.0, what probably could be the impact. Again, I do understand that the impact would differ from each setup. So based on the setup, based on the